When the millionaire Alejandro Mendoza approached Carmen, the waitress serving drinks at Madrid's most exclusive charity ball, and mockingly told her he would marry her if she danced better than all the high society ladies filling the room, he didn't expect her to accept the challenge. All the guests laughed at the cruel joke of the heir, who always humiliated the service staff to entertain his friends. But when the orchestra began to play, and Carmen removed her white apron and walked to the center of the dance floor with the dignity of a queen, something in the atmosphere shifted. Because what no one in that ballroom knew, what Alejandro would never have imagined looking at her waitress uniform, was that Carmen had been a principal dancer with the Spanish National Ballet until a family tragedy forced her to give it all up. And when her feet touched the parquet and she began to move, the silence that fell over the room was so absolute that you could hear the heartbeat of every person present. If you're ready for this story, write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Carmen Vega was 24 years old and had been working as a waitress at Madrid's high society events for 2 years. It was a job she hated with every fiber of her being, but one she desperately needed, one that allowed her to pay her mother's medical bills, maintain the small apartment they shared on the outskirts of the city, and put food on the table, even if it meant swallowing her pride every night. No one who saw her in her black and white uniform, her hair pulled back in an austere bun, held by a simple golden hairpin, would imagine what she had been before. With the lowered gaze the job demanded, to avoid bothering the gentleman, they wouldn't imagine what she had been before. No one would see in her efficient movements serving glasses of champagne, the high leaps and pirouettes that had once made the audience of Madrid's Royal Theatre weep with emotion. Carmen had been a ballet prodigy since she was 5 years old, when her mother took her to classes at the cultural center in their Andalusian village, simply so she would burn off energy. The teacher, a former dancer with the Seville Ballet, saw something special in the girl who barely reached the bar and recommended her to a talent scout who was visiting the area looking for new talent for the National Ballet School. At 8 years old, Carmen left her village in Córdoba and moved to Madrid on a full scholarship that covered her studies, accommodation, and living expenses. Her parents visited her every month, saving for weeks to afford the trip, and they watched her grow into that ethereal creature who seemed to float when she danced. By 18, she was already a soloist, the youngest in the company's recent history. At 20, she was a principal dancer, with reviews comparing her to the great legends of Spanish ballet, with invitations to perform as a guest star with companies in London, Paris, and New York. Her brilliant future seemed written in the stars, etched in stone, as inevitable as the dawn. But stars sometimes go out without warning, and stones can break. 2 years ago, her father died of a sudden heart attack in the kitchen of their Córdoba home, collapsing to the floor while preparing breakfast he would never eat, leaving behind unknown debts and a devastated mother who fell into such a deep depression that she tried to take her own life. Carmen had to choose between her career and her mother, between the stage she loved and the woman who had brought her into the world. It wasn't a difficult choice, although the pain of making it still woke her up some nights with tears in her eyes. She abandoned ballet, sold everything of value, and became what society expected of a village girl with no money or connections, an invisible person who served the rich while they pretended she didn't exist. Alejandro Mendoza was exactly what he appeared to be, an arrogant heir who had never worked a day in his life and who treated service staff as if they were furniture with legs. At 30, he had inherited his father's fortune, a real estate empire that allowed him to live without a care while collecting luxury cars, designer girlfriends, and the empty admiration of those who hoped to benefit from his money. That night, at the Crystal Palace charity ball, Alejandro was bored. The same old faces, the same empty conversations, the same women approaching with calculated smiles, waiting for an engagement ring he never intended to offer. It was then that he saw Carmen collecting empty glasses from a nearby table. There was something different about her, something he couldn't identify, but it caught his attention. Perhaps it was the way she moved, with a grace that didn't suit a simple waitress. Or perhaps it was her face, beautiful in a natural way, that the women in his circle, with their surgeries and treatments, could never match. His friends noticed where he was looking and started to tease him, as they always did when Alejandro fixated on someone they considered beneath his level. One of them suggested he ask her to dance, and another added that she probably wouldn't even know how to move without tripping over her own apron. Alejandro, fueled by alcohol and boredom, decided it would be fun to humiliate the waitress in front of everyone. He approached her with that superior smile that always worked to intimidate those who didn't have his money and uttered the words that would change everything. He told her, loud enough for everyone around him to hear, that he would marry her if she danced better than all the ladies present in the room. It was a cruel joke, designed to embarrass her, to make everyone laugh at the absurd idea that a mere servant could compete with women who had taken dance lessons their entire lives. The guests who heard him laughed as expected, that polite yet dismissive laughter that high society uses to mark class differences. The ladies looked at Carmen with condescending pity, expecting to see her blush and flee to the kitchen, as anyone else in her position would have done. But Carmen didn't blush or flee. Something ignited in her eyes, something that had been dormant for 2 years beneath layers of resignation and survival. She looked directly at Alejandro, without the submission he expected, without the fear he was accustomed to seeing in those who worked for people like him, and accepted the challenge. The murmur that swept through the room was instant. Some thought she was crazy, others that she hadn't understood the joke, others that it would be the most embarrassing spectacle of the night. Alejandro himself blinked in confusion, unsure how to react to someone who wasn't following the script he had written. Carmen slowly and deliberately removed her white apron. She let her hair down from its austere bun, allowing it to fall in dark waves over her shoulders, and walked to the center of the dance floor, with a dignity that silenced even the last of the laughers. The orchestra, which had been playing background music to set the mood for conversations, stopped at the sudden silence of the room. The conductor, an older man with decades of experience at events like these, looked in the direction everyone was looking, and saw Carmen standing in the center of the floor, waiting with a stillness that wasn't nervousness, but absolute concentration. Alejandro, feeling obliged to maintain his charade to the end, even though he was beginning to suspect he had made a mistake, made an exaggerated gesture to the orchestra to play something appropriate to ridicule a waitress. The conductor, not knowing exactly what was happening but instinctively understanding that something important was occurring, chose a piece he knew by heart. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's continue with the video. The Adagio from Swan Lake, perhaps the most recognizable ballet music in the world. The first few bars filled the room with their characteristic melancholy, those notes that speak of love and tragedy and impossible beauty. And then Carmen began to move. What followed would be etched into the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives. One of those stories they would tell their children and grandchildren, even if no one quite believed them. Carmen began to move, and it was as if time stopped, as if the laws of physics ceased to apply, as if gravity had decided to make an exception just for her. Her arms rose with the fluidity of cascading water. Her feet touched the ground as if they weighed absolutely nothing. Her body became the music itself in a way that none of the ladies present, with all their private lessons and professors imported from Paris, could ever match. She wasn't dancing like a waitress who had learned a few steps in her spare time. She wasn't dancing like a talented amateur. She was dancing like what she was. An artist trained for almost 20 years in one of the best ballet schools in the world. A principal dancer who had performed on the most prestigious stages in Europe before kings and presidents. A woman whose talent had been compared by the most discerning critics to that of the great legends of classical dance. Every movement was perfect. Every line of her body told a part of the story of the swan dying of love. Every expression on her face conveyed emotions that words could never capture. It was pure art, distilled beauty, the kind of performance that only happens when someone is born with an extraordinary gift and dedicates their entire life to perfecting it. The silence in the room was so profound, so absolute, that you could hear the rustle of her black dress against the polished parquet, the whisper of her perfectly controlled breath, despite the physical exertion, the almost imperceptible sound of her feet executing steps that required years of relentless training to master. Alejandro watched her with his mouth agape, all his arrogance evaporating second by second as the color drained from his face, and he understood the monumental mistake, the catastrophic error he had made in choosing this woman as the target of his cruelty. When the music ended and Carmen took her final bow, the silence lasted for 3 more seconds before erupting into applause. It wasn't the polite applause of high society, but genuine ovations from people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. A woman sitting at one of the main tables stood up with difficulty and walked towards Carmen. It was Doña Esperanza Vega Castellanos, the matriarch of one of Spain's oldest families, a patron of the arts, and former president of the National Ballet's board. She recognized her immediately. She told Carmen that she had seen her dance 3 years ago at the Royal Theatre in a performance of Giselle that had made her cry. She asked what a dancer of her talent was doing serving drinks instead of performing on stage. Silence fell over the room again, but this time it was different. It was the silence of those who had just realized they had misjudged someone, that appearances deceive in ways that can shame those who believe themselves superior. Carmen briefly explained her situation, without self-pity or drama, with the dignity of someone who had accepted the hand life had dealt her, even if it wasn't fair. She spoke of her sick mother, of her father's debts, of the choice she had to make between her career and her family. Doña Esperanza nodded slowly, recognizing in Carmen something she rarely saw in young people today: real sacrifice, true love, strength in the face of adversity. And then she turned to Alejandro, who still stood where the dance had left him, pale and mute. She reminded him, in front of the entire hall filled with Madrid's elite, who hung on her every word, that he had publicly promised to marry Carmen if she danced better than the other women present. She asked, in that voice that had intimidated ministers and tycoons for decades, if he was a man of his word, or if his promises were as hollow as everything else in his life of undeserved privilege. The ensuing silence was devastating. Alejandro stammered something about it being a joke, that he hadn't been serious, that no one expected him to keep a promise made in jest, that everyone understood it was entertainment and not a real commitment. But each excuse sounded more pathetic than the last, more cowardly than the one before, and the contemptuous glances he received from those who, minutes earlier, had been laughing with him, told him clearly that he had lost something that night that no amount of money in the world could ever buy: the respect of his peers. Carmen intervened before the situation became any more humiliating for everyone present, including herself. She told Doña Esperanza, with a dignity that shamed several of those present, that she did not wish to marry anyone who had treated her as Alejandro had, that she preferred her dignity to any fortune in the world, and that her only true desire was to be able to dance again someday, when her life circumstances allowed. Doña Esperanza smiled, that smile of someone who had just found exactly what they had been searching for without realizing it. She offered Carmen a position at the art foundation she presided over, a job that would allow her to care for her ailing mother with a decent salary, while remaining connected to the world of ballet she so loved. She solemnly promised, before all witnesses, that when Carmen was ready to return to the stage, she would personally open every door necessary. Carmen accepted with tears in her eyes, tears that this time were not of sadness or humiliation, but of pure hope, the kind of hope she had lost 2 years prior when she had to choose between her career and her family, and which now reignited like a flame that had never truly gone out, but merely slept, waiting for its moment. A year later, exactly 365 days after that night in the Crystal Palace, Carmen danced professionally again at the Teatro Real in Madrid. The performance was Giselle, the very ballet Doña Esperanza had mentioned remembering, and Carmen interpreted the lead role with an emotional depth only those who have known true pain and survived to tell the tale can possess. Doña Esperanza was in the front row, impeccably dressed as befitted the occasion, alongside Carmen's mother, who had finally recovered enough from her depression to see her daughter do what she was always born to do. The two women wept throughout the performance, but they were tears of pride and joy. Alejandro Mendoza was not invited to the premiere, nor to any of the subsequent performances, but those who know him say he watched the televised broadcast of the performance from the solitude of his empty mansion, surrounded by luxuries that no longer brought him any satisfaction. They say he wondered for hours how his attempt to humiliate a mere waitress to amuse his friends had become the night that destroyed his social standing and marked the beginning of the second life of an extraordinary artist. And Carmen, under the stage lights she had once believed lost forever, danced that night as she had never danced before in her entire career, with the infinite gratitude of someone who knows that miracles sometimes come disguised as humiliations that force us to show the world who we truly are. If this story has reminded you that true talent cannot be hidden, and that sometimes our worst moments become the doors to our best futures, leave a trace of your passage with a heart. And if you wish to support those of us who tell stories of redemption and second chances, you can do so with a heartfelt thank you through the Super Thanks feature below. Like Carmen, who never stopped being a dancer, even when the world only saw a waitress. Even the smallest gesture of generosity can reveal who you truly are.